The morning mist hung over the palace gates like a gray curtain. Officer James Crawford stood at his post, back straight, eyes forward. 23 years of service had taught him to notice everything. The click of heels on pavement, the rustle of a coat, the slight tremor in someone's hand, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. A black sedan pulled up to the side entrance. Not the main gate where tourists gathered with cameras. This was the service entrance, where deliveries arrived and staff came and went in silence. The car door opened. A woman stepped out, sunglasses covering half her face despite the cloudy sky. James recognized her immediately. The whole world would if she carried a box. Medium-sized, wrapped in cream paper with a golden bow. Her steps were careful, measured, like someone walking toward something they both wanted and feared. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. We share the most emotional true stories every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. James didn't move from his position, but his mind raced. Protocol was clear. No unauthorized deliveries. No exceptions. But this wasn't just anyone standing before him. "Good morning, officer," she said. Her voice was softer than he expected, almost nervous. "I have something for Her Majesty. A personal gift." James glanced at the box, then at her face, then at the security camera above, its red light blinking steadily. Every second was being recorded. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify this through proper channels," he said. His tone was respectful, but firm. 23 years. Never once had he bent the rules. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I understand. It's personal. For me to her, a gesture of goodwill. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. James had read the headlines. Everyone had. The interviews. The allegations. The family torn apart on television screens across the world. Goodwill seemed like a word from another lifetime. "I'll need to inspect the contents, ma'am," James said. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Disappointment? Anger? Fear? It was gone before he could be sure. "That won't be necessary," she said, pulling the box back slightly. "It's sealed. It's meant to be opened by her alone." James felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Behind those palace walls, centuries of tradition lived and breathed. Rules existed for reasons deeper than anyone outside could understand, and he was the guardian of those rules. Not because he wanted power, but because someone had to stand firm when everything else was chaos. "Ma'am, with all due respect, nothing enters these gates without inspection. No exceptions." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. A pigeon cooed from somewhere above. Traffic hummed in the distance. The woman's jaw tightened. She said quietly, "So that's how it is. Those are the rules, ma'am. They apply to everyone." She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the box in her hands, the palace behind him. Two worlds that once were one, now separated by more than just iron gates. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, a bitter one. The kind that comes when you realize the truth you'd been avoiding. "Return to sender, then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave. But James saw it. The slight shake in her shoulders, the way she gripped the box a little tighter. "Ma'am," he called out. She stopped, didn't turn around. Just waited, and what James said next would change everything. "Asterisk, I'll make sure your intention is noted in the log," James said carefully. "That you came. That you tried." Her hooding, she turned her head slightly. Not enough to see her face, but enough to show she'd heard him. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Intentions don't change outcomes, do they, officer?" Before James could respond, she was gone. The sedan pulled away, leaving only the smell of exhaust and the echo of her words. James stood alone at the gate. The box was gone, but something heavier remained. He reached for his radio, thumb hovering over the button. He should report this. Protocol demanded it. But something made him pause. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. The world was already watching, even if they didn't know what had just happened. They would soon enough. They always did. Inside the palace, life continued as it always had. Staff moved through marble hallways. Clocks ticked in rooms full of portraits. Somewhere in those ancient walls, decisions were being made that would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. James completed his shift at 6 p.m. He went home to his wife. Margaret, who had tea waiting like she did every evening, she could read him better than anyone. "Rough day?" she asked, pouring milk into his cup. "You could say that." James loosened his tie. The uniform that usually felt like armor now felt like a weight. "I saw the news," Margaret said quietly. "They're saying she tried to deliver something, that she was turned away." James closed his eyes. Of course, the press already knew. Palace walls had ears. Some of them were paid very well for what they heard. "I did my job, Maggie." "That's all I know you did, love." She sat across from him. "But doing your job doesn't always make it easier, does it?" He thought about the woman's face. The way she'd held that box like it contained all her hopes. The bitter laugh that said she'd expected exactly what happened. "She's a mother," Margaret continued softly. "Whatever else is true, whatever happened between them all, she's a mother who wanted to reach out. And you're the man who had to say no." "The rules exist for a reason," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Do they?" Margaret asked. "Or do they exist because we're afraid to change them?" That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. Every word, every choice. At 2 a.m., his phone lit up. A message from his supervisor. Brief, direct. "Good work today. Your adherence to protocol is noted." Good work? He'd done good work. So why did it feel like he'd failed some invisible test? The next morning, the story exploded across every newspaper, every website, every television screen. Photos of the sedan. Close-ups of the palace gates. Speculation about what was in the box. Experts analyzing body language from grainy security footage. But what struck James most was the comments section of one article. Thousands of people arguing, fighting, taking sides. Some called him a hero for following rules. Others called him heartless. A pawn in a game much bigger than himself. One comment stayed with him. That guard had a choice. He chose duty over compassion. But history will remember which one mattered more. When James arrived at the palace that morning, something was different. The air felt charged. Staff members who usually nodded at him looked away. His fellow officers were quieter than usual. At noon, he was called to the supervisor's office. A small room, windowless, filled with filing cabinets and the smell of old paper. "Sit down, Crawford," Supervisor Walsh said. His face was unreadable. James sat. His heart hammered against his ribs. "You're aware of yesterday's incident," Walsh began. "Yes." "Sir, you're aware it's been covered by international media?" "Yes, sir." Walsh leaned back in his chair. "You followed protocol exactly. You did everything by the book. And yet..." He paused. "There are those who believe exceptions should have been made." James felt ice in his stomach. "Exceptions, sir. Powerful people on both sides of this situation. Crawford. Some believe you did right. Others..." Walsh let the sentence hang. "What are you saying, sir?" Walsh pulled out a file, opened it. Inside was a single photograph. The woman at the gates. The box in her hands. And James, standing firm. That sometimes doing your duty puts you right in the middle of a war you never signed up for. James stared at the photograph. In the picture, his face was stone, professional, unmovable. But he remembered what he'd felt inside. The conflict. The human moment beneath the uniform. "Sir, I need to know," James said carefully. "Am I being reprimanded or commended?" Walsh closed the file. "Neither. You're being protected?" "Protected from what?" "From becoming a symbol." Walsh stood and walked to the small window overlooking the courtyard. In situations like these, everyone looks for someone to blame or praise. You're easier to reach than the people behind these walls. James felt something cold crawl up his spine. Are you saying I'm in danger? I'm saying you've become interesting to people who make careers out of other people's pain. Walsh turned to face him. The press wants interviews. Activists want you to pick a side. Everyone wants you to speak. I won't, James said firmly. I don't comment on, I know you won't. That's why you're valuable. But silence has a price too. Walsh sat back down. Your patrol has been changed. You'll be inside the palace grounds for the next month. No gate duty. No public-facing positions. Sounds like I'm being punished. It's protection, Crawford. For you and for the institution. Things are delicate right now. James left the office feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. 23 years of service. He'd guarded presidents, prime ministers, diplomats. He'd stood in rain and snow and scorching heat. And now, because of one moment, one choice, everything was different. That evening, a letter arrived at his home, hand-delivered, no return address. Margaret brought it to him with worried eyes. It was left in our mailbox, she said. James, I don't like this. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. Expensive paper. Handwritten in elegant script. Officer Crawford, you don't know me, but I know what you're going through. Years ago, I was the person between two powerful forces. I chose protocol over heart. I've regretted it every day since. You still have time to choose differently. Some rules are worth breaking. Some bridges are worth building. Think carefully about which side of history you want to stand on. A friend. James read it 3 times. His hands trembled slightly. What does it say? Margaret asked. He handed it to her. Watched her face change as she read. This is manipulation, she said firmly. Someone's trying to use you. Someone's trying to help me see clearly, James. Margaret took his hands. You're a good man. You've always been a good man. Don't let anyone make you doubt that now. But doubt had already crept in, like water through a crack in stone, slow, persistent, damaging. The next day, James did something he'd never done before. He researched, he read every article about the royal situation, the interviews, the accusations, the defenses, the pain on both sides. He learned about a family fractured by duty and love, pulling in opposite directions, about traditions that protected and imprisoned, about a woman who'd tried to fit into a world that wasn't built for her, about another woman who'd spent her entire life serving that world, bound by promises made before she could walk, and he learned about himself. About the moment he became a footnote in a story much larger than him. On his phone, a video had gone viral. Someone had enhanced the security footage. You could see her face more clearly now. The hope when she arrived, the defeat when she left, and his face unmoved, doing his duty. The comments were vicious. Look at him. Not a shred of humanity. He's just following orders. Where have we heard that before? Maybe he saved them all from something dangerous. We don't know what was in that box. Doesn't matter what was in it. It matters that he didn't even try. James put the phone down. His reflection stared back from the black screen. Who was that man? The one everyone was talking about? Was it him? Or was it a version of him that existed only in other people's minds? That night he dreamed. He was at the gates again. But this time, he took the box, opened it. Inside was a mirror. And in the mirror, he saw not himself, but everyone who'd ever stood where he stood. Every person who'd chosen duty over compassion, or compassion over duty. An endless line stretching back through history. He woke up sweating. Margaret was already awake beside him. You cried out, she said softly. I don't know if I did the right thing, James whispered. I've been so sure for so long. But now you're human, Margaret said. That's not weakness. Love. That's wisdom. The next morning, James made a decision. A dangerous one. One that could cost him everything. Asterisk, he requested a meeting with the head of palace security, not his immediate supervisor. At the top. A man named Sir Richard Thornberry. who'd served 3 generations of royals and had eyes that saw through everything. Getting the meeting was nearly impossible. But James was persistent. He used every favor he'd earned in 23 years, called in debts from colleagues, pushed until someone finally said yes. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. 3 days away? 3 days that felt like 3 years. During those days, more happened. A former palace aide gave an interview claiming the box contained letters. Personal, heartfelt letters attempting reconciliation. Another source said it was photographs, family memories. A third claimed it was jewelry, returned items that didn't belong in her life anymore. Nobody knew the truth, but everyone had an opinion. James walked through those days like a ghost. He did his rounds inside the palace grounds, nodded at staff, stood at attention during shift changes. But his mind was elsewhere. On Wednesday evening, his daughter called. Sarah, 28 years old, a teacher in Manchester. She'd been quiet since the incident, and James knew why. Sarah had always been the compassionate one, the one who questioned authority, who fought for underdogs. "Dad," she said when he answered, "We need to talk." "I know what you're going to say, Sarah. Do you?" Her voice was strained. "My students asked me about it today. About my dad who turned away a woman trying to make peace. How do I explain that?" James sat down heavily. "I was following protocol." "Protocol," Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When I was 16, I broke curfew, remember? I snuck out to help my friend whose parents were fighting. You could have grounded me for months, but you didn't. You said, some rules exist to guide us, not trap us. You said knowing when to bend is what separates good people from rigid ones." James closed his eyes. He remembered that night. Sarah, tearful and honest, explaining why she'd disobeyed, and he'd hugged her. Told her he was proud she'd chosen compassion. "That was different," he said weakly. "Was it? Or are you just afraid of what it costs to be consistent?" The line went quiet. Then Sarah's voice softer. "I love you, Dad, but I don't recognize you in that video. The dad I know would have found a way." After she hung up, James sat in silence. Margaret didn't say anything. Just brought him tea and sat beside him. Sometimes, love is just presence. Thursday arrived too quickly. James put on his dress uniform, the one reserved for important occasions. If he was going to do this, he'd do it properly. Sir Richard's office was in the oldest part of the palace. Stone walls. Paintings of long-dead nobility. A desk that had seen centuries of secrets shared and buried. Sir Richard himself was 71. Tall, lean, with silver hair and a face that gave nothing away. He gestured to a chair without pleasantries. "Officer Crawford," he began, "you requested this meeting. I've granted it. You have 15 minutes. James had rehearsed this moment, but now, sitting here, the words scattered like leaves in wind. "Sir, I need to know something," James said. "What was in the box?" Sir Richard's eyebrow raised slightly. "That's classified. Sir, with respect, I've become the face of this incident. The world has judged me without knowing the full truth. I think I deserve to know." "Deserve?" Sir Richard leaned forward. "Crawford, you've been in service long enough to know we rarely get what we deserve. We get what we earn. Sometimes not even that." "Then tell me I did the right thing," James said. His voice cracked slightly. "Tell me that turning her away protected something worth protecting." Answer. Richard stood, walked to the window. Outside, tourists took photographs of the palace. Smiling, laughing, oblivious to the storms that raged inside these walls. "Do you know why these gates exist, Crawford?" Sir Richard asked. "To protect the royal family, partially. But more than that, they exist to maintain the separation between symbol and human. The moment we forget that separation, the entire system collapses." But Sir James ventured carefully. "Aren't they human first, before their symbols?" Sir Richard turned. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger. Something more like sadness. "20 years ago," he said quietly, I turned away a young prince who wanted to leave through a side entrance to avoid photographers. I made him use the front. Follow protocol. He was furious with me. Sir Richard paused. He died 3 months later. Car accident. Fleeing photographers. James felt the air leave his lungs. Every day since, Sir Richard continued, I've wondered, if I'd let him leave quietly that day, would it have taught him that escape was possible? Would he have been bolder when it mattered? Or would it have made no difference at all? He returned to his desk. We can't know, Crawford. We can only choose between imperfect options and live with the consequences. What was in the box, sir? James asked again, quieter now. Sir Richard sat down, pulled open a drawer, removed a folder. Inside was a report. He turned it so James could read. The box had contained a journal. Handwritten entries, thoughts about family, reconciliation, hope for healing, and photographs. 2 children, smiling. Asterisk James stared at the report. His throat tightened. Children, he whispered. Grandchildren, Sir Richard corrected, who may never know their grandmother, or who may reconcile tomorrow. We can't predict which. Was there anything dangerous? Anything that justified no? Sir Richard cut him off. Nothing dangerous. Nothing manipulative. Just sadness, wrapped in hope, delivered to a door that wouldn't open. He closed the folder. But here's what you need to understand, Crawford. If you'd let it through without inspection, you'd have violated protocol. If it had contained anything problematic, you'd have been responsible. Your job is impossible. You can only lose. James felt something break inside him. All the certainty he'd carried for decades. The belief that following rules was enough. That duty was its own reward. Why are you telling me this? James asked. Because you asked. And because I think you're strong enough to carry the truth. Sir Richard's expression softened slightly. Most people aren't. They prefer the comfort of not knowing. But you came here demanding answers. So now you have them. What do I do with this? That, Sir Richard said, is entirely up to you. James left the office in a daze. He walked through the palace corridors, seeing them differently now. Not as halls of power, but as walls between people who loved each other, or used to, or wanted to again. He thought about the woman at the gates, how she must have debated for days, maybe weeks, whether to come, the courage it took to face possible rejection, the hope she'd carried in that box, and he'd sent her away. That night, James couldn't go home. He called Margaret, told her he needed time to think. She understood. She always did. He drove to a park near his childhood home, sat on a bench he'd sat on as a boy. When the world was simpler and right and wrong were clearly marked, an elderly woman sat down beside him. She didn't ask permission, just sat, feeding pigeons from a paper bag. You look troubled, young man, she said after a while. James almost laughed. He was 56. Nobody had called him young in years. I made a choice, he said. A hard one. And now I don't know if it was right. The woman tossed more seeds. My husband used to say, there are 2 types of hard choices. The ones where both options are bad. And the ones where both options are good, but you can only choose one. What's the difference? With the first, you're trying to minimize damage. With the second, you're trying to choose which good thing matters most to you. She looked at him with kind eyes. Which type was yours? James thought about it. I chose duty over compassion. Are those opposites? In that moment, they were. The woman smiled. Then maybe the question isn't which you chose. Maybe it's whether you can find a way to honor both, even after the choice is made.
Ow.
She stood to leave. Choices aren't endings, young man. They're beginnings. What you do next matters more than what you did then. James sat alone as the sun set. The park grew dark. Streetlights flickered on. And slowly, an idea began to form. Dangerous, career-ending, possibly. But right. Finally, undeniably right, he drove back to the palace, found a piece of official stationery, and wrote a letter. To whom it may concern, on the morning of November 14th, I was the officer on duty when a delivery was attempted at the palace gates. I followed protocol as I was trained to do. But protocol doesn't account for everything. It doesn't account for grandchildren who deserve to know their family. It doesn't account for wounds that need healing more than they need protecting. I cannot change what happened that day. But I can acknowledge that sometimes doing your job isn't the same as doing what's right. I hope, in time, there will be space for both duty and mercy in these halls. For the sake of everyone on both sides of these gates. Respectfully, Officer James Crawford. He read it 3 times. Then he did something he'd never done in his career. He sent it not to his supervisor, not to Sir Richard, but to the press officer who'd been hounding him for comment, and he went home. Margaret was waiting. She took one look at his face and knew. "You did something," she said. "I did something." "Will it cost you your job?" "Probably." She hugged him. Tight. Then it must have been important. The letter went public the next morning. Not as a quote, but as a full statement. James Crawford's face was back on every screen. But this time, the story was different. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some praised his courage. Others called it a betrayal. The palace remained silent, which spoke volumes. James was called in at 9 a.m. He knew what was coming. He wore his uniform one last time, pressed and perfect. If this was the end, he'd end with dignity. But the person waiting in the supervisor's office wasn't Walsh. It was Sir Richard. "Sit," the older man said. James sat. "That was remarkably stupid," Sir Richard began. "Or remarkably brave. I haven't decided which. Sir, you've created a situation." James's letter was on the front page. The palace is now forced to respond. "You've made it impossible for us to stay neutral." "I know, sir." "I accept whatever consequences you accept." Sir Richard's voice rose slightly. "Crawford, you don't get to choose your consequences. They choose you." He stood, paced. "Do you know what you've done? You've given voice to something everyone was thinking but nobody could say. You've made it human." James waited. "There are people in this building who want your badge, sir," Richard continued. "They say you've violated every principle of service, discretion, loyalty. Silence, I understand. But there are others," Sir Richard said, "quieter now, who say you've done what they wish they'd had the courage to do years ago. Who say that maybe it's time for these walls to have doors, not just gates." James looked up. "Sir?" Sir Richard sat back down. "You're being transferred. Not fired. Transferred. To a position with no public-facing duties, no media access. You'll serve out your final 2 years in relative obscurity. And then you'll retire with full honors." "But Crawford," Sir Richard leaned forward, "you can never speak about this again. This conversation, this moment, is where your public voice ends. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Sir Richard pulled out one more document. "This came this morning. Through private channels, it was a handwritten note, brief, unsigned. Tell Officer Crawford, received. And thank you." James's hand shook as he read it. "Is this I don't know what you're referring to, sir," Richard said firmly. "I'm simply showing you a piece of paper that arrived on my desk. What you make of it is your business." James left the office different than he'd entered. Not lighter. Not heavier, just changed. The next 2 years passed quietly. James worked in archive management, cataloging historical documents. No gates, no cameras. No moments that tested his soul. Sarah visited more often. She never said it explicitly, but he could see the pride in her eyes. His daughter had her father back. The one who knew that rules and compassion weren't enemies. Margaret grew roses in their garden. They talked about what they'd do in retirement. Travel, maybe. Visit grandchildren when Sarah eventually had them. Live a life where the hardest choice was what to have for dinner. But one evening, 6 months before his retirement, something arrived in the mail. A package. No return address. Inside was a book. A published memoir, and tucked inside the front cover was a photograph. 2 children, smiling, and a handwritten note. They know their great-grandmother's name now. They're starting to understand their story. Bridges take time to build, but someone has to place the first stone. Thank you for placing yours. May you find peace in your choices, as I'm learning to find peace in mine. James showed Margaret. She cried. Happy tears, sad tears, all mixed together? Did it matter? James asked her. Everything I did. Everything I risked. Did it change anything? Margaret took his face in her hands. My love, you'll never know the full ripples of your choices. None of us do. But you chose to be human instead of just right. And somewhere, someone noticed. Someone heard. That's not nothing. On his last day of service, James stood in the palace courtyard one final time. 25 years. Quarter of a century? He'd stood in rain and sun, through royal weddings and funerals, through protests and celebrations. A young officer approached him, fresh-faced, eager, nervous. Sir, the young man said, I read about you, about what you did. Some of the veterans say you broke protocol. Others say you saved it. I'm starting at the gates tomorrow. I don't know which one to believe. James looked at him, saw himself at that age, full of certainty, sure that the world was black and white, duty and disobedience, right and wrong. Listen to me carefully, James said. The gates are important. The rules are important. They exist for good reasons, but they're not more important than the people on either side of them. Someday you'll have a moment, a choice that doesn't fit neatly into any protocol. And in that moment, you'll have to decide who you are beneath the uniform. What should I choose? Choose to sleep at night. Choose to look your children in the eye. Choose to be remembered as human, even if it means being forgotten as perfect. James put a hand on the young man's shoulder. The gates will stand long after we're gone. Make sure your conscience stands just as strong. James walked out of the palace for the last time. The gates closed behind him with a soft metallic click. Final, permanent. But as he walked away, he didn't look back with regret. He looked forward to Margaret, to Sarah, 2 grandchildren not yet born. To a life where he was no longer caught between duty and heart. The story faded from the headlines eventually. Other scandals emerged. Other controversies. The world moved on, as it always does. But in a quiet house on the outskirts of London, James kept that photograph. The children, smiling. And sometimes when the weight of old choices grew heavy, he'd look at it and remember. He'd been a guard. He'd stood at gates. He'd followed rules and broken them. He'd been praised and condemned. But in the end, he'd been human. And sometimes, that's the only gift worth giving. The gates still stand. Officers still guard them. And somewhere, on both sides of those ancient walls, people still hope that someday the doors will open just a little wider. Not for everyone. Not all the time. But for the moments that matter most, for the grandmothers and grandchildren, for the wounds that need healing, for the stories that deserve endings softer than stone. James Crawford never knew if his choice changed history, but he knew it changed him. And in the quiet of his retirement, surrounded by roses and love and peace finally earned, he decided that was enough.